All right, so this is, once again, Notes Toward a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling. And, or at least I'm fairly certain that it's part of a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling. But the indeterminacy, we'll explore a bit as we explain the focus in this particular segment of the discussion. And I believe this is, once again, part 12, danger, deception, deluSIon, dramaTikos, eironicUs, dramaTikos, aNagnoREikos, daulis toward delPhi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy in America. But, once again, there's a certain amount of indeterminacy as to whether this is part 12, danger, deception, deluSIon, dramaTikos, eironicUs, dramaTikos, aNagnoREikos, daulis toward delPhi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy in America. We have been adding to David's original title. And the reason that there's a certain amount of ambiguity, I suppose, is because this could appear to be, this particular interpretation and reading could appear to be another interlude or intermission in our discussion and continuation of our reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretations. But whether this is, in fact, part 12 or an intermission in the course of our 17-part reading, it will address the number 12 and the significance of the number 12, and perhaps the significance of our expansion of this section and the length of time that it's taking us to complete part 12. And as Eric A. Havelock reminded me in a dream that I had last night, and we'll discuss that briefly before discussing what this image is. This will be the 17th section of our part 12. Danger, deception, deluSIon, dramaTikos, eironicUs, dramaTikos, aNagnoREikos, daulis toward delPhi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. And as Eric, Havelock reminded me that we had initially promised a 17-part reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's varieties of rhetorical deception in narrative and non-narrative storytelling. And this part 12 was to be part 12 of a 17-part reading. Now, that 17-part reading, if it were distributed, right, as a bijective function across the segments, that we have provided, there would be 17, right? There would be 17 recordings of this initial, this first Notes Towards a Metapoetics of Narratology. There would be 17 sections. And since our sections typically, I think typically take around 2 hours. They're perhaps between an hour and a little bit over 2 hours. The recordings, of each of these segments, and the reason is that they don't go on longer than that is simply because in any lengthier a segment requires too much work, for us to get up on the YouTube channel. In fact, even any segment over an hour, usually in order to get it even into my computer, from the cell phone from which I'm recording it, I have to break it up and then piece it back together on the program that I have in on my iMac, and piecing it back together creates certain problems, as some of my audience may have noticed in the technical display, right, and in the technical synchrony between the images that are presented and the sound, and often there will be gaps and pauses and jumps and leaps that are somewhat unpredictable, and the longer the piece, the more difficulty the different programs have apparently interfacing with one another and putting them back together. So that's ideally, I suppose that this part 12, even the lengthiness of part 12, could ideally, if we had the perfect technology for our project, that is, that there was a relationship between the muse whom we have been referring to as delUSIs and our resources, then we could simply produce that bijective function by producing well, let's say that we have seven. This will be the 17th, and if we imagine that there, even on the high end, 2 hours, I think is a generous amount of time to factor in as an average. So 17, obviously 17 times 2 is 34, and then we're not done yet. So if one imagines that we're halfway through a period of perhaps 68 hours would be required for part 12, danger, deception, deluSIon, dramaTikos, eironicUs, aNagnoRisis, aNagnoREikos, daulis toward delPhi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of a democracy, to which we have been adding in America. But I believe, and then if we had made a single verbal recording, recording of our discussion, and it was 68 hours long, then we would have been able to retain that idea of the delUSIs of the bijective function as it corresponds to part 12. But I believe even in the first few segments in our recording of, and I don't remember where they occur now, but I believe that there perhaps even before we reached part 12 were instances in, and I may be wrong, and I perhaps need to go back and review some of these discourses and productions of this discussion regarding the metapoetics of paranarratology. But I believe even before we reached part 12 that there were a few instances of segments that failed, right, to conform to the bijective function segment by segment, and we would have had to already have made those corrections prior, to the lengthy 68-hour production that we're estimating now. We would have had to have made for part 12. But it certainly could have been done, and if we had the resources available, right, for creating such a piece, and if YouTube and if YouTube the commercial domain of YouTube allowed us to put up a 68 hour discourse. I don't know that they would, but if they did, and their technology, right, afforded that opportunity, then we would have been able to retain that relationship of the one-to-one correspondence between these various parts, and perhaps we wouldn't have to engage this discussion. But even so, even if we had maintained that telaisis of bijective function that I'm describing here in the segments that precede Part 12 and in Part 12, once again, which I'll title Danger, Deception, Delusion, dramaTikos, eironicUs, dramaTikos, aNagnoREikos, daulis toward delPhi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. Even if we had retained the telaisis of such a imaginary bijective function, it seems likely to me that Eric A. Havelock would have still appeared to me in the form of in one of my dreams, and noted how lengthy the production of this Part 12 is in comparison to the amount of time that we've spent on the sections which precede it, 1 through 11, and perhaps would have attempted to to explain that in the same way that he explained what he described as what seems to be an apparent refusal on my part to move beyond section 12, and a mythological and symbolic interpretation of some of the reasons perhaps why, which I found fascinating and somewhat remarkable in their insight, and his and in doing so, and in explaining all of that, his continuing critique of Joseph Campbell, and in more ways than just referring to Campbell as a hack, but perhaps if not explicitly, implicitly, the contextualization and the attention to detail on Havelock's part in reading, my apparent refusal to move forward from this section 12, implicitly providing the terms of a critique through which one might engage Campbell's construct of his one should perhaps note 17-part, right? 17-part construct of the hero's journey, and which is highly gendered journey, right? Havelock reminded us, and hence problematic, and perhaps and perhaps that's the and the suggestion though of the relationship between these gendered symbols, like such as Diarmenia Sheshapont, right, the Sphinx, and as guardian of a kind of gateway, right, and her promised columns that Tiresias used as a enticement, right, and a reward for her cooperation in his plan, his seggio, for the elimination of both Oedipus and Laius, right? These columns on which, or column that she would rest, as guardian figure, and the comparative analysis that's implied by this, and listeners, viewers, and readers and interpreters of the work that we perform as a contract in phi through theta will recognize this form that I'm presenting here as the form of what we refer to as a desktop ekphrasis. So if there was a desktop ekphrasis for today, it would be based on this image. And this image I haven't selected. This image was selected by, in quotation marks, the randomization, right? Or whatever, algorithmic, operation and in combination with, hacking interference or the ghost in the machine, perhaps we could say, or ghosts in the machine, right? Seems to have selected this image. So, as again, readers and interpreters of my work will realize, I don't buy, fully and wholeheartedly into the idea of the aleatory nature of phenomenon, that is chance. And it seems to me that, a phenomenon is rather overdetermined than it is determined by accident or some such. And the synchrony of synchronicity, it would be the term that Jung utilizes, but the synchrony or the synchron, involved, in what is not chances, I'll just put it that way, what is not necessarily not chance's selection of this image, and the discussion that we've been having as the Sphinx as guardian of this place called Thebes, and where we're moving toward, which is Diomedes Sheshurpank's relationship to the Sphinx at Giza, but all of these various lion gates, and not just this one, that is figured as a symbolic guardianship of the entrance to Jerusalem, right? These are the inscriptions over the gateway, which is one of the entrances to the ancient city of Jerusalem, and the guardian lions, being obvious, symbols of such a protectorship, right? Correct. And but lion guardian figures are how to put it? I don't want to say, I don't want to follow the mistakes of a Joseph Campbell and universalize them, but I want to say that they are in a certain area of the ancient world, right? The Middle East and Greece and this area that corresponds, roughly with what, roughly with what outdated, right, and anthropological and archaeological discourses referred to as, in quotation marks, and the quotation marks are intended as, critical, but the cradle of civilization, right? And so you see, such gates in archaic and ancient, Turkish cities as well, and one thinks of the Mycenaean, lion gate, and the Mycenaean lion gate, the lions look, quite different than than these lions. In fact, the lions, in Mycenae, could be compared to wolves in their appearance, and that arc, right, that in which they're inscribed, perhaps determines the appearance of that curve that draws them closer to the form of perhaps a wolf. And we'll get there when we get to what Havelock had to say about the 12th tribe of Israel, Benjamin, right? the ravenous wolf, and or I hope that we'll get there and make that comparison. Although Havelock had so much to say in this dream that he presented himself in last night that I worry and fear that we may never reach that point. Well, having established that this is the desktop ekphrasis, I'll begin to move on and describe. I'll begin to describe what Eric had to say about this part 12. Excuse me, about this part 12 and our what appears to be refusal to move forward or to move beyond the symbolic significance of this particular number, and to fill it with an infinitude of significances that belong to all of these different domains. The idea of action, the idea of schedule, the plan, the idea of gnosis, and the idea of descending, ascending, and he begins with a question, and the question itself is a question that I heard in the dream before I even realized that it was Havelock asking the question, and it appeared in the form of a riddle in a certain sense, and but it was a strange riddle, and so what I heard was what is betwixt and between, what is betwixt and between light and darkness. What is your favorite day and night of the year? And what is the third question which belongs to this riddle? And what a strange form for a riddle to take. What is betwixt and between? What is betwixt and between light and darkness? What is your favorite day and night of the year? And what is the third, and missing question in this riddle? And I guess if I had to think about it now, the answer to the third part of the riddle would have to be how is the number 12 also the number 21? And in that, and if that's the case, and if I had the foresight in this dream to respond, and if I had the foresight to understand that it was Eric Havelock, perhaps asking the question, perhaps I would have responded. How is the number 12 always also the number 21? And he would have liked that, and he would have said, very good. But I didn't. I was still trying to figure out who was asking me the question, and solve the first two parts of the riddle without getting that perhaps the third part had to be asked first. And the reason that the reason that the answer to the third part of the riddle is another riddle, and that riddle is, why is the number 12 always already also the number 21, is complex, but relates in complex ways to my personal experience, and to my favorite day of the year, and a kind of egocentrism for having that day, although it could be universalized, I suppose. But my favorite day of the year, and to the numerological values represented by my astrological chart, and let's begin with that, and address the riddle as Havelock asked it from that point first, and then we can expand on the conversation that he and I had in the dream and explain why, and as a means of like moving through a possible explanation of why I'm why I continue, right, to move beyond. Even now we will be moving beyond the 17th installment of this section 12. So let's begin with the astrology. In my birth chart, my sun sign is Leo. So here she is, or he is, and here he or she is again, and Leo is the guardian of this gate. And if we count the petals on this mandala star, we'll count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and the astrological significance of the number 8 is that Leo is the 8th month of the year, and my birthday is on the 16th day of August, and I was born in the year 1964, and so there are a lot of 8s in all of that, and I associate all of those 8s in my birthday with this particular sign of Leo, and apparently someone else does too, or they wouldn't have put the 8 petals of the sun mandala here in this figure, and perhaps another number that would have been appropriate in this particular sign and seal, right? I think we want to call this a seal, don't we? I think another number that would have been particularly appropriate if we wanted to move it away from the symbolic significance of the lion would have been 12, for obvious reasons, but we'll discuss them in fuller detail as we move through Eric Havelock's reading interpretation and elaboration of my failure to move beyond the number 12 in this particular discourse, but that's my sun sign, and that's represented here. But both my rising signs, both my rising and my moon sign is Sagittarius, right? The archer, and that sign, of course, in as it relates, to the duration of the calendar of the year, begins, one could say roughly in November 21st, and concludes or reaches its completion, right? Reaches its completion or terminus, or one could say ending as telAIsis, if one imagines that completion and finishing and ending belongs to this idea of perfection in that the muse telAIsis represents, right? And of course the the date December 21st, if we represent the numerical values of that date, beginning with the month 12 and finishing with the day 21, there are. It is both a numerical palindrome, but also represents the fact that the relationship between the number 12 and the number 21 on that date, right, are reverse images of one of themselves. And why that is significant is not simply because it's an arbitrary or accidental phenomenon, but the length of that particular day, right, as the shortest day of the year, and the terminus, right, of one could say a duration of light that decreases, right, to a certain number, and then at that point begins to increase, is also an image, right, a palindromic image of light, if one imagines it that way, or if one imagines it as an hourglass, and the sand, right, that fills the top of the hourglass, filling that point in the middle of the hourglass, that's the narrowest point, right? This is the narrowest point of light in the year, and that might seem a dark that might seem a dark reference, and perhaps it is, and there are certainly, if one imagines that light versus the absence of light is knowledge and beauty and truth and all of that, and that shadow holds none of that. I suppose that it's possible to regard an appreciation of this particular date, and the selection of this particular date as belonging to a pessimistic idea of universe, but I don't see it that way at all. I have always felt comfortable and warm and protected in night, but also it there's another story about my appreciation of this date, and it belongs to this date, and I believe it was in the year 2012, and for whatever reason, I was returning from Gallup, New Mexico, to my residence at that time in Round Rock, Arizona, on the Navajo Nation, and for whatever reason, I had been in Gallup. I was returning to Round Rock, and on the radio, one of the DJs to the station, I was listening to a Native American station, and one of the DJs, a woman, made reference to this day, the shortest day of the year, and interpreted it very optimistically, and in a way that I really appreciated and don't think I'll ever forget, and said we're playing this song because from now until the middle of next year, right, we are entering a duration of expanding light, And the way that she said, duration of expanding light, or whatever she did, I probably didn't say duration. That's a term that I would use, and doesn't sound very colloquial, does it? But the way that she referred to the idea of expanding light, sounded very mystical to me. And then she played the Beatles, and I'm not a big Beatles fan, but the song that she chose was Here Comes the Sun, and all of that, it suddenly occurred to me that that day, 12/21, the winter solstice, and the way that day is configured as the terminus or completion or teleiosis of both my moon sign and my rising sign, and the way that it marks this concept of here comes the sun, relates that day back to my other sign, right? And here's the sun, and here is the lion, and here is the other lion, and in this idea, right, of the coming sun, is the promise of a certain kind of a return, and that all of that is perhaps a way of explaining why the answer to the third part of the riddle that Eric asked, even before I was aware that it was Eric, was why is the number 12 always already also the number 21? But that being the answer to the riddle, I suppose we could end there and and not move on, in a sense, not move, again, fail to move, beyond the 12 or the 8 or wherever we're stuck. But I want to talk more about the details of Havelock's discourse in this dream, and so and the way that, in a certain sense, that it's a critique of Joseph Campbell. So once I kind of recognize his voice, because he's come to me in dream already, as my listeners and viewers will know, and so I recognize that it's as one doesn't one's not really groggy in dream, but there still is an orientation period. It's not like waking up and you're still asleep because you are asleep, right? But there's still an orientation period in dream, just as there is in waking life. And once I realized that in this orientation or liminal period of recognition of this dream as, right, symbolically significant, once I recognized that this is Eric's voice and that he has more to say, and I'm thinking he's gonna correct more of my errors, and I'm really worried about it. But this, in fact, it turns out to be really more of an interpretation and diarmeniae of the errors than it is simply calling attention to the errors, and eventually hopefully we'll get there in this part 12 and not have to break this part of part 12 up into more part 12s. But in a way, he also explains, why I perhaps utilized the incorrect word analepsy, ascension, for the middle term that I wanted to provide in relationship to the construct of a crossroads, and it's fascinating the way that he does it, and that middle term. Ascension, relates both to this sign as it refers to the expression, here comes the sun, and to the sign that we could say, 12 and 12. 12 as it is squared, 12 by 12 represent, as a representation, of the 44,000 that has become important, to us, and the 12 sets of 12,000 that belong to the seals, right, of the 12 tribes that John of Patmos describes in the 7th chapter. Is it of the Apocalyptos, the revealing, right? And the revealing here, let's not miss that interpretation as revealing, right? Apocalyptos as perhaps opposed, but also alongside anagnorisis, right? And I'm so happy that it was Eric that and honored in a way that that Eric would come to me in dream. I'm not a classical scholar, but and require a lot of help, and in more than one way, not just help of the graphos or graphy, but help with the gryphos as well, right? The gryphos, the reference to the fishing basket and its alternative usage, right? As an alternative synonym for enigma and enigmata, right? So I need help both with the graphos, the writing, and the gryphos. And what a better person, like at the conjunction of the gryphos and the graphos, could one imagine being your assistant than Eric Havelock, right? Because, writing, the graphos, is so much a part of his discourse, but so is the enigma or the gryphos, so it more than makes sense for the guide here and interpreter, the diarminon, to be Eric Havelock. In any case, so we begin this conversation, and he says, he refers to me as a contract in V through theta, which is also kind of nice, because it takes it out of in a certain way, it takes it out of the strictly personal and brings it into the performative and actional, right? One could say actional, and perhaps as praxis and as drasi, but as they relate to Sheggio and other aspects, of the coming toward aNagnoREikos, Anagnorisis, and the coming toward whatever whatever figure of completion and teleiosis that we want to put in that final position, whether it's one of the ones that he initially suggested, such as ecstasis, or another term elsewhere. But he begins with this question. He says, "Oh, contract in V through theta, So you seem to be stuck on this section 12, and it says let's begin from where we left off. What would Joseph Campbell have to say about that? And I'm like, I'm not sure what you're suggesting. And he says, well, what number of the 17-part hero's journey is represented by the numerical value 12? And so I go, that's the what? And I'm I'm not so viewers and readers of my work, and anyone who's known me for a long time and known the way that I teach classical mythology when I've taught classical mythology will know that Joseph Campbell doesn't have a part in it. And so I'm not real familiar. I'm like, I don't know. Is that the apotheosis? Is that why that you came back and you're gonna say that this has something to do with why I selected the wrong word, and he says no. The apotheosis in Joseph Campbell's schemata is number 10. And it's like, oh, okay, that makes sense in a certain way, because apotheosis is like 10 is like the number of the fingers that you have on your hand twice, and completion and teleiosis in a certain way, perfect number 10, base 10, yeah, it makes sense. Okay, so that makes sense in a certain way. So I say, well, so what's the number 12? And he said, well, 12 is the refusal of the return. And refusal of the return. Well, that makes sense. So it makes sense being stuck right on number 12 at the refusal of the return. But I know that we're not just going to end there, because I know Eric isn't a super big Joseph Campbell fan, and has referred to Joseph Campbell as a hack, and we're going to go a lot further than that. So he says, so if it's the refusal of the return, and where are you? And then like he wants me to demonstrate that I can put this into play, and I know that we're on the same discursive page, and that I have the background to have this discussion, right? So I say that's the guy, right? That's the guy in Plato's account of the cave that went out and knows that those forms are more than the way that they appear in the shadow world, and has seen the light, but he doesn't want to go back to the cave and tell anybody, and he says, and put it in a personal way. And then so I have to put it in a personal way, and I'm like, the personal ways are harder, because we have an audience, and we don't want to reveal that stuff to them. He says, just do it. And so, okay, so in a personal way is, those times when I would receive a revelation, like after the death of that child on the Navajo Nation, and the horror of that offense, and when I was instructed to tell 3 elders, in the Navajo Nation, that in honor of the death of it's hard, Eric. In honor of the death of the sacred child, there was, not supposed to be use of the sweat lodge, because the sweat lodge was where the murderer was found for a period of 36 months. Four times 9 months. 3 years. 3 years and 4 times. Three years and 4 times 9 months. Eric. And, then, Eric, notes that the number 12 is inscribed in that amount of time, as is, the 9 months, and talks about that and the symbolic significance of 9 months and the symbolic significance of 3 years, and says why is this a return, and why is there a resistance to the return? And I say because sometimes that even if something is supposed to be honored, you also know that the message that you have to send is going to be refused, right? And it's so you argue with the one who sent you, and the refusal of the return isn't necessarily what Joseph Campbell thinks it's. You want to stay there in the land of the lotus eaters, right? And enjoy the bliss of nirvana. Sometimes the refusal is just that it's so painful in this Cassandrian sort of way to be ignored, and that you're bound to fail, right? And so then Eric says, very good, that's the first part, is understanding what was left out of the construction of the refusal of the return. It's not about lotus eaters, is it? Or bliss. The refusal of the return is a refusal because the return is painful in a different way. It's the pain of knowing it's the Cassandrian pain of knowing the outcome and not being able to influence the result. And this is what you're talking about with Tiresias. So it's not so much a problem with the idea of a return, but the way that it is constructed, at least in this instance, right? And so we go like, is this really going to be this hard, Eric? The whole thing? He's like, no, not the whole thing, just that part. You see, that's 112. That's one number 12 that you thought was a 10. But he says, but we'll get to the apotheosis. Don't worry. I'm like, great. And this isn't really very pleasant so far. All right, so what's the 12th card in the major arcana? He says, and this one I know. I've just been, and probably I know it in a weird way. Like I don't know it, as an occultist, might know it, or a practitioner of readings of the tarot. But I probably know it through Italo Calvino, and this wonderful piece that he had called the Castle of Crossed Destinies, and the way that these tarot cards become elements in the creation of story, in fact two different sets of storytellings through the tarot cards. So I'm like, okay, so it says, well, what's the 12th card in the tarot? And I say the Hanged Man, and he says, who is the Hanged Man, and what does the Hanged Man represent? And I say the Hanged Man is Odin, and it's a card of learning and revelation, but not of revelation really, but of slow learning and patience and waiting. And this is like, so how is that card situated? How is Odin on the tree, hanging on the tree, and that card about not moving on? I'm like, well, it's slow waiting. It's like a hibernation of patience, right? And he says, yeah. So so you're in this card, and you're you're performatively embodying its significance, but it's also a card of transformation and of acquiring wisdom and knowledge, but slowly, but doing so slowly and patiently. That's that. And he says, and how many cards are in the major arcana? And I say, well, if you take the Fool as the operative, if you take the Fool as the operative that moves through the castle of its destiny, or the cross through all of these stages, right? Then, and you take the Fool. If you take the Fool as 0, and you're talking about a number beyond the Fool, then it's 21. He says, isn't that the way it's numbered? And I say, yeah. So he says, so how many cards are in the major arcana? And I say, well, 21 plus the Fool. And he says, that's exactly right. And so what's the 21st card? And I say, that's the world, right? And says, so what does the world represent? Well, it represents the finish line, or the completion, or the totality. And it's like, in Greek, and what you've been talking about, what would that represent? And I say, the idea of telaisis. And so the hangman is the waiting one, right? And in a certain way, right, you have that palindromic, representation between like this refusal to move on and hang there forever, and the completion. And what is completion to you? And what is your obstacle? And we talk a little bit about the graphos again, and the dysgraphia, and how long it takes me to complete something, and the idea of a seal, or a sealed letter, and how I was asked to write someone's name backwards, and how much that hurt. And we're back into the I can't speak, Eric, and I want to say, fuck you. Thank you for putting me here. And he says, how does the I can't speak relate to the idea of seal? And in what senses is there a seal? And breaking of seal. And seal can be closed, Eric says. And seal can be also, a sign and a mark. Like mark us holy. That line in the Burning Spear song, Winston Rodney. And he says, okay, so you were talking about telaisis and when you and its relationship to completion and perfection in the grand piano, and how you don't have this muse of telaisis, and you can never reach world, and how you had to write this name backwards, and if you write the 12 backwards, it's 21. You could never reach the destination of telai. I don't remember how he says it, because his Greek is a lot better than mine, that's for sure. But he puts it in adjectival form. Telaisis as and completion, perfection as an adjective. And what was the obstacle in signing the name backwards? And it's like, well, there's two obstacles in signing the name backwards. The first is I can't do it physically because I'm dysgraphic, but the second is that I don't want to, because it just seemed wrong. It just seemed wrong. And to do it is to play into the game, the game of you can't do it. and to play, into, being forced to do something wrong. And what's the obstacle? Well, the obstacle is, to face that that relationship now is broken forever, and you will never acquire that seal. And so if you attempt to inscribe it backwards, or upside down, or however, it's no longer that's that. Is an upside down lion, still a lion? And I say, probably not. He says, well, is an upside down, hangman still a hangman? I said, well, reverse cards, have shadow meaning in the arcana. He says, yeah, reverse cards have shadow meaning. So then that can be good or that can be bad, depending on how you look at it. But it becomes an obstacle in your journey, or if it is a journey. But you can't get at stuff like this, Eric Havelock says, if you look at Campbell, because you haven't done the work. And the abstract features in the refusal of the return, right, are all going to come out of misreadings as land of the lotus eaters. And they're not going to bear upon the depths of the pain. And they're not going to be narrative. They're going to be little stories. And what kind of a model, is a story without pain? If it's supposed to be part of the archaeology of a relationship to transformations of consciousness. And I'd say, there's a lot of pain in all of this, Eric. He says, yeah, and that's precisely the point. So there you are, Eric says, the hangman Odin in your tree, writing backwards or upside down or in reverse, and not being able to get to the teleiosis of 21, right? The world card. And you're not exactly, Tom, that character Tom, played by Elijah Wood in the grand piano, but you're something, more interesting. And you're still there on that day, December 21st, playing out, your last day in Sagittarius. That belongs, to this waste of the hourglass. And if you take that in Freudian terms, it's you could take it as the waste of time, but it's not the waste of time as in it's not the waste of time as in you're fretting your time away. It's the waste of time. It's the narrowest width of time that also is the most expansive moment for you. So the paradox is that the waste of time, the narrowest length of time that's represented by this day, is the day that you expand. Is the day that you expand into your eternity. And you're not going to get there if you. And then I'm like, give me a break. This hurts. And and then Eric does give me a break, because he returns to the critique of this simplified notion of the heroic journey in Campbell, and he says, and you're not going to get there if you abstract the work and the movement into this idea of a refusal of the return in this realm of bliss, right? And then okay, so she said, okay, and you have to do the work of the comparative analysis as well. So where are we in this? Where are we in your desktop ekphrasis? And it's weird, because I'm like, I don't know, because we're not there yet. We're only there now, right? So Eric, in the dream, Eric is prescient about where we are now, and he says, well, where do you think we'll be? And I said, well, I guess we'll be at the seal. And he says, the seal where? And I say, at the lion gate, because of Diarmenia Shesapunk, the living image, the stone. And I say, fuck you, Eric, I can't speak again. And he says, that's because you're doing the real work. He says, all right, so you're at the Lion's Gate. And there are 8 petals of light on the sun. And what do the 8 petals represent? And I say they represent the stages of light. And he says, how? And I say, because when the year is divided in 2, it's divided into 2 solstices. The greatest length of light and the smallest length of light. He says, good. And when it's divided in 4, and I say it's divided into, greatest and smallest and the equinoxes of equidistance between. And he says that's 4. And the rest, and and I identify the segments between. The segments that mark the betwixt and between least, greatest, and equal. Good. So the mandala is always a calendar. It always exists in time. So you're in time. And you're in time at the end, at the shortest, and you don't want to move on. But at 12, in the arcana, at the hanged man, in the waiting, you don't want to move on to the completion. And for whatever reason that you expand this into your eternity at the waste of time, you also see its connection, its paradoxical connection, right, to the world at 21. And you see also that that it's your inability and let's say it's a matter of writing. And I'm like, well, your whole thing is writing, Eric. He says, yeah. And that's why I'm here. And if it's a matter of writing, you're never going to get it perfect because you can't. So if your telaiasis is in your writing by hand, your hands, you'll never reach your telaiasis, your perfection, and be granted access to world. But what else is there? You know, what else is there in this reverse image of telaiasis at 12, in this darkness? It's like, well, in the embrace of the darkness and the embrace of the pain, like, who can do that? And it's like, well, I guess, you know, someone who's willing to encounter the shadow. And that's your book, isn't it? And he's referring to the book called the 144. So let's talk about the 144 and move on from the seal and the seals of light. So he says, so how many tribes of Israel are there? And I say, well, 12. And he says, that's kind of obvious, right? And he says, he says, what's the 12th of the tribes? And I say, that's what, the tribe of Benjamin? He says, that's the tribe of Benjamin. He says, what does Benjamin mean? And I say, I think it means, you know, child of my right hand. He says, yeah, okay. And what does, you know, Benjamin represent? And I say, I think Benjamin represents warfare and anger and strife and fighting, right? The ravenous wolf. And he says, right, the ravenous wolf. So I say, so where are we going? He said, well, just be patient. So how many labors of Hercules are there? He says. And I say, well, 12. And he says, where conceptually are the labors of Hercules located in Joseph Campbell's conception of the hero's journey? And I say, I guess that's what, the road of trials. He says, yeah, it's the road of trials. That's 6. And where are the? He said, where would you inscribe the stations of the cross if you had to inscribe all of the stations of the cross in one moment in the hero's journey? And I say, I don't know, that's impossible. That's not a bijective function. And he says, right. He says, because the trials, or the road of trials themselves, right, are a complex set that don't correspond to a single moment in any journey, but are distributed across the journey in complex and multiple ways according to the individual nature of whoever the subjectivity that you're talking about, what you refer to as a positionality. And that's another problem with the construct, is that it doesn't have it doesn't have a post-positive understanding of time. And because it doesn't have a post-positive understanding of time, it can't have a significant understanding of symbol and the mysteries. And you only ever have dumb heroes like Hercules, like being inscribed in a road of trials and coming up with simple solutions to problems that only appear to be, complex and unsolvable. And then he says, what's the 12th station of the cross in the Via Crucis? And I say, the 12th station of the cross is the crucifixion, death. And he says, what card in the major arcana does the crucifixion correspond to? And I say, well, it's the hangman, isn't it? It's Odin on the tree. And he says, so the 12th station is also the 12th card. And I say, yes. And he says, and what's the 12th station in the Via Lucis? And I say, the Ascension. And I say, fuck you, Eric, I can't speak again. And he points to the seal. That, now in the dream, you can see. And I say, fuck you, Eric, I can't speak again. And he says, what's the 12th station in the Via Lucis? And I say, it's this Ascension. And he says, well, you can speak now. And then I laugh. And he says, what's if you imagine the Ascension as a card in the tarot and you turned it upside down, if you imagine, he says, and I'm like, okay, this is getting complicated, Eric. He says, if you imagine the Ascension, the 12th station of the Via Lucis, as a card in the major arcana and you turned it upside down, what would it correspond to in the hero's journey? And I have to think about this for a while. But then it becomes clear to me, as clear as the nose on Pinocchio's face. It would be the refusal of the return, Eric. And he says, it would be the refusal of the return. And then he says, in the 12th station of the Via Lucis at the Ascension, where does Christ go when he rises to heaven? And I say, he returns to his Father. And he says, if that were a Greek word, what would it represent? And I say, telaisis. And he says, where does he go when he returns to his Father? And I say, I don't understand what you're asking. You just asked the same question twice. He said, and then he puts it in the form of a riddle. He says, well, you answered that. You answered that first riddle that I gave pretty well. So let's try that again. Let's do it the way that Dharmedia Sheshapunk would do it. All right. What tribe of Israel? What tribe of Israel does Jesus go to after the ascension? And then I get what he's saying. It's like, oh, Benjamin, the 12th tribe, the completion. And he says, why? And I say, because the name Benjamin means child of my right hand. And that's and I say, fuck you, Eric, I can't speak again. And he says, and then he completes it for me. And that's where that child goes, isn't it? To the right hand of the name. And because I can't speak in that moment, I nod my head like Aaron, poor Aaron. And then at this point, I say, so are we there? Is that all? He says, well, you're still hanging in the tree, but now you know what it means. But now you know what your patience means, he says. So I say, are we there? Have we finished? Have we completed? Have we reached the telaisis? Are we at the number 21? He says, well, you're still hanging in the tree, but now you know why you're there. And he says, and I'll tell you this, Joseph Campbell would have never gotten you where we are right now. And I say, all right. I'm going back to bed, Eric. I'm going back to a different kind of sleep that's not so difficult, but perhaps not so interesting either.